Okay, let's start in. So we're talking about anxiety, and we had just reviewed obsessive compulsive disorder. What are obsessions? Those repetitive, unwanted, intrusive thoughts you can't get out of your mind, and most of the time you know they're irrational. And what are compulsions? The behaviors you do to try to at least temporarily get rid of those thoughts by compulsively cleaning to get rid of those thoughts of germs and infestation. And what's the problem? The compulsions only in a short term assuage the obsessions, and they come back again, and it's a vicious cycle. Now, what's post-traumatic stress disorder? Technically, as you know, you're supposed to be taking Psych 130 now, or have taken it before as a prerequisite for this class. That isn't always the case, and this is more of an adult disorder, so that's discussed more in Psych 130. Post-traumatic stress disorder is the only disorder in the whole DSM that has a specific cause. Back in the day, in DSM 1 and 2, all mental illnesses were supposed to be caused by psychodynamic conflicts. And then DSM 3 said, we're not sure about that theory, it's hard to get reliability, we're just going to give lists of symptoms. And we'll let the neurobiologists and the psychosocial researchers figure out causes. We're going to get reliable by focusing on symptoms. And PTSD was one of those disorders with lists of symptoms. But in PTSD, how do you get it? You've experienced an event that either could have cost you your life, or symbolically it was life-threatening. And the thinking is that if you've experienced such a hugely traumatic event, much of the time, if not most of the time, you will develop a characteristic set of symptoms. So it's the only disorder that has a specific cause. Now, does everybody who's experienced a life-threatening trauma develop PTSD? No. Which leads us to think along the lines of developmental psychopathology. There's vulnerabilities. There's other risk factors besides the traumatic event. There must be something that the person brings to the equation, which is why not everybody develops the full set of symptoms. What are the kinds of traumatic events that are thought likely to lead to PTSD? Sexual assault, being a prisoner of war, being in battle, experiencing a tornado or a hurricane or a tsunami that's ruined your place, a natural disaster. Held up at gunpoint. How severe does the trauma have to be? It's thought to be life-threatening realistically or symbolically, but of course there's many traumatic events one might experience that aren't quite life-threatening, so you might get a continuum of PTSD symptoms. Now for adults, and this is pretty descriptive, we're racing through this, what are the three main classes of symptoms? Most people with PTSD experience a lot of the day a kind of feeling of removal. You're kind of numb, you're a bit out of it. Maybe this is a defensive reaction against having experienced such a traumatic stressor. Numbness or avoidance. The second symptom is the one that's most stereotypically linked to PTSD. You've got nightmares or you've got daytime flashbacks. You're involuntarily re-experiencing the trauma. Maybe it doesn't take much of a trigger. You were in Vietnam 50 years ago, and now a weather helicopter goes overhead, but just the sound of those chopper blades puts you in, and you're back in the battle scene. You're walking down a street where you were held up. It's another street. Looks like it's getting to be dusk, and my God, that experience is happening again. I can see the guy pulling out the knife, and so a re-experiencing. And then the third symptom class is that it's kind of an interesting counterpoint to the first. When you get triggered, your body's in a perpetual alarm state. You're very reactive. You startle more quickly. You tend to freak out of any reminder of the traumatic event. So maybe the numbness is a way of kind of keeping that at bay, because your body's kind of, again, in this perpetual high alert state, and you want to try to avoid the trauma of re-experiencing in your mind, nightmares or flashbacks, what it was like when you were traumatized. So the big question for our class is, how about kids who've been sexually traumatized or physically beaten, or kids who've experienced natural disasters? Do they have these same three symptom classes, and do they experience them the same way adults do? Yes and no. If you're really interested in the topic, there's a lot of people in the trauma fields and in the developmental psychopathology field who are trying to really examine in what ways are these three classic symptom clusters pretty similar in kids versus adults, and in what way do kids experience and show symptoms differently. For example, maybe a kid is going to have a hard time putting on a psychophysiological monitoring device, and they may not experience alarm in the same ways, but maybe some of their acting out aggressive behavior is actually a symptom of PTSD. Maybe some kids who can't concentrate or preoccupied, maybe even numbing themselves. Well, is that ADHD, or is that actually a symptom of PTSD? Do they have this biological condition called ADHD with all the risk genes we talked about? Or were these kids who were traumatized and they can't focus in class because it's PTSD? Or could it be both? Could there truly be a comorbidity? This gets to be controversial. If it's really a post-traumatic stress disorder, but you're treating the kid with a stimulant for ADHD, what do stimulants do? They goose up your dopamine system. Maybe that's going to make them more prone to be alarm ready or alarmed. So there's theoretical debates that are quite heavy about, what about a kid who's been traumatized, who's also having trouble focusing in the classroom? How can you make a differential diagnosis between post-traumatic stress disorder and ADHD? Or could it be that some kids are vulnerable to both? What about treatment? Now, again, this could be 2 lectures on this topic alone. PTSD became a diagnosis in 1980. Lots of women's groups, survivors of sexual assault and rape, Vietnam vets, lobbied the American Psychiatric Association to recognize this is a real disorder, a real condition. And at the same time, people were struggling with how to treat it. I mean, it's been around for a long time. It used to be called the shell shock syndrome after World War I. There's documents of PTSD after the Civil War, after the Peloponnesian War in Greece 2,500 years ago. But now it's a recognized psychiatric disorder. So what do? If I've experienced a very difficult trauma, and I'm having nightmares every night, or again, I hear the helicopter overhead and I flashback, maybe what I need to do, one theory says, is sit down with my therapist and go through the trauma in vivid detail. I'm back in Da Nang, or I'm back on that dark corner where I was sexually assaulted, or I was in my home as the hurricane warnings were coming in. Re-experience it consciously. Go through in detail by detail what happened, so that your conscious mind will take over and your unconscious mind won't have to have these flashbacks and nightmares. What's the problem with that way of thinking? More recent research suggests you could be re-traumatizing the person. Going through these detailed, minute-by-minute re-accounts may not in fact be making you immune, but it's like now you're re-experiencing it again. So some of the more current therapies for PTSD would suggest that, yes, you do have to talk about it and confront it. You don't keep it buried. But after some mid-range of doing that, you focus on coping strategies so that the therapist isn't inadvertently re-traumatizing the individual. Sometimes medications are used, SSRIs to cope with the depression, anti-anxiety medications. They're certainly not cures for PTSD, but they might help the person cope if the flashbacks and the startle is very intense. Question? Yeah, of course, it's hard to get a person in the brain scanner when you're having a flashback. Or you're having a flashback. Let's race down to the research center and get you in the scanner, right? Hard to do. But when people have been prompted in the brain scanner, mildly to re-experience, yes, there are emotion centers in the brain circuits that are lighting up, unlike people without PTSD. So certainly there's a brain-based set of circuits that might underlie the alarm and the numbing. Is it perfectly diagnostic? No. Other questions on PTSD. The big issue is, how do kids experience this? They may not have the classic nightmares and flashbacks. They may have externalizing or internalizing behaviors that kind of sub in for the numbness or the hyper-alarm, and it's a big debate. This isn't like, oh my God, we know exactly how to diagnose PTSD in kids, and here's how it's different from PTSD in adults. So, what causes this range of anxiety disorders? Well, the old psychodynamic theory suggested that something bad happened in your childhood, and that made you susceptible to be afraid of dogs. And the dog phobia is a substitute for the deeper conflict. Most of that theorizing doesn't have a lot of evidence base. What's the one disorder for which a traumatic event is necessary? Well, we just talked about it, PTSD. But there have been twin studies, identical twins and fraternal twins who've gone to Vietnam or the Gulf War. And both of them have been in the same situation, pretty much. Same battlefield. Identical twins are much more likely to both have PTSD than are fraternal twins. So it can't be just the trauma. Maybe there's some biological predisposition inherited that makes some people more likely to have a full-blown PTSD in the wake of such trauma and other people not. What does the behavioral social learning perspective have to do with anxiety disorders? We don't know exactly why you get afraid of the bridge, or you get afraid of dogs, you get afraid of public speaking. Maybe it's temperament, maybe there was a bad event. You got associated, classical conditioning-wise, anxiety with the stimulus. We're not so clear on how that happens. What's very clear in anxiety disorders, though, is what happens next. Remember the bridge. My God, I'm going to make it over the Golden Gate Bridge today. I know I can do it. I've been working with my therapist. I can see the spans above the fog. I'm in Sausalito, and I take the last exit. What happens when I take the last exit? Negative reinforcement. I'm in an aversive state. I'm feeling terrified. I'm almost in a panic. What happens when I take that last exit? What am I rewarded for? Avoiding the bridge. How am I rewarded? My anxiety drops. Whew, I ducked that one again. So why are phobias and anxiety disorders so persistent? Because of not so much the classical conditioning that we assume caused it, but because of the operant conditioning, the negative reinforcement, the avoidance of that anxiety by escaping the feared stimulus. Very powerful. What's the theory of most treatment of anxiety disorders? Get the person to confront the feared stimulus. Remember, slowly through systematic desensitization, or fast by flooding, dangling over the corner of the bridge with the sharks below. Either way, you're going to extinguish. How heritable are these anxiety disorders? Well, they're not as heritable as ADHD. They're not as heritable as we'll talk about next time, bipolar disorder. But they're not zero. There may be something about negative affect when you're an infant. There may be something about reactivity. Some infants are very susceptible to any novel stress, really freaks them out. And maybe there's a heterotypic continuity that kind of wiring makes you susceptible to get freaked out by any one of a number of stimuli and anxious about them. What do parents have to do with this? Remember the parents of the very reactive infant? Now a 3-year-old, oh honey, we don't have to go to that birthday party. Those are scary kids. We'll stay in the car with mom and dad and have our own birthday party. What does that do? Reinforces the kid for not going to the birthday party. So the anxiety of going out is worse next time. It's the same negative reinforcement. Theoretically, families of people with anxiety disorders are both overprotective and enmeshed and highly critical. Everybody else is going to that birthday party. Why can't you? What's the matter with you? Our family's social. Is the family criticism and overprotectiveness a cause or a consequence? Or what about good old gene-environment correlation? Maybe the parent, who's a bit socially anxious, gives 50% of his or her genes to the kid who's a bit socially anxious, and these are the kind of parents who want to protect the kid because they didn't like to be freaked out when they were a kid too. So it's gene-environment correlation may be another relevant mechanism. All right, so we're done with that question in the back. Yeah. Yeah, so we're pretty clear that we're seeing more ADHD in kids for some of the reasons we talked about. Anxiety disorders are quite prevalent, but we don't have the same database asking parents about anxiety disorders we do about ADHD. We don't have the answer. Good question, though. You might think, yeah, parents are kind of overprotecting, others be more. Or are parents overprotecting more because there's actually more anxiety? It's one of those chicken and egg questions. Question here. So PTSD prevalence in kids, hard question because people haven't decided if the same adult criteria should apply to kids. Given the amount of child abuse and neglect, given the amount of natural disasters, PTSD is not infrequent in kids. It's going to be several % of kids. Boy and girl rates are fairly similar. Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah, how would you prevent PTSD? Can you make everybody more resilient? Hey, look, we're in California. When's the next earthquake coming? Before 1030? Or next year? Or next decade? Good question. If we thought about it too much, we'd probably all have anxiety disorders. But if we do what we normally do, which is never think about it at all, we're not prepared. So it's a big question. Can we make people more resilient to trauma? Or are there some traumas, losing everything in a natural disaster, being held up at gunpoint, being a prisoner of war, being raped, that our bodies really aren't able to cope with, and the main treatments will be after effect? Good theoretical question. Don't have a good answer to that. All right, in interest of time, let's talk about depression, another classic internalizing disorder. So from Psych 130 that you're supposed to be taking or have taken, we'll talk more about depression in a minute, but adult depression is very prevalent and it's very impairing. It's thought to be the first or second most impairing disease on the planet. Can kids get depressed? Can an 8-year-old get depressed? Well, the answer through the 1960s was absolutely not. Kids can't get depressed because they have not matured enough in their psychosexual development. This comes from Freudian theory. You can't really be depressed, the theory goes, until your superego is developed and you've got a conscience and you know right from wrong and oh my God, I failed and I've internalized and I've got this guilt and shame. If you don't have all those kind of concepts in your mind, you can't get depressed. What was happening, though, in the 60s? Kids were killing themselves. The suicide rate among kids was going up year by year. So the epidemiologists were saying, hey, theoretically, kids are getting depressed, but in real life, they're seeming very depressed. So, racing through history, in the mid-1970s, a number of researchers in sort of the forerunners of developmental psychopathology said, wait a minute, maybe we've been wrong. Maybe a lot of kids actually get depressed. But because of some of these developmental issues, kids don't get sad and feel guilty and feel suicidal. Kids mask their depression. Kids transform their depression into other symptoms, like bedwetting, or aggression, or learning problems, or ADHD was then called hyperactivity. So what was in the 60s the theory that the prevalence of child depression was? 0%. By the late 1970s, what was the theory of the prevalence of child depression? About 20% of all kids. Because all bedwetting and learning disabilities and ADHD and externalizing problems were actually masked depression. This is not a good scientific state of affairs when you go from 0% to 20% because you've changed the definition. These are sometimes called depressive equivalents. Kids can't express depression the way adults do, so they'll kind of act out depression in these substitute ways. What happened in the 1980s? Well, DSM-3 came out. And for the first time, there were specific symptoms of depression that you could interview an adult about, or you could actually interview a kid about, or the kid's parents about. And it was thought for a time that, boy, we thought it never existed, we thought it kind of existed too much. There is depression in children. It's rarer than depression in adults, but when it occurs, it looks a lot like adult depression, if you really bother to ask carefully about those symptoms. What do we think now? Developmental psychopathology has kind of taken over, and yes, kids can get depressed. Happens a lot more once puberty occurs. When it exists, there are a lot of symptoms that look a lot like adult depression, but there are some developmental differences. So, in infancy, kids who've been abandoned, or kids who've been in those Romanian orphanages, the old term is analytic depression, their depression is shown by a kind of lethargy and insensitivity to the environment. Preschoolers who are depressed can actually look irritable and sometimes aggressive or very clingy. So you get a little separation anxiety, you get some externalizing. By grade school, kids don't concentrate very well when they're depressed. Well, adults who are depressed don't concentrate very well. There's irritability. There may be externalizing features over and above the sadness of depression. Then when the kid starts middle school, you start to see, I feel terrible about myself. I'm probably responsible for why my parents are divorcing. I might actually, if the depression gets very severe, I'm responsible for the poor economic conditions in the United States. My life isn't worth living. People would be better off without me. So the guilty, self-blaming, internalized feelings of depression really tend to come out in the early adolescent years. If an 8-year-old comes to your clinic and is really depressed, this is a kid who needs treatment, because there's big prediction that this kid will have later depressions in life. If a kid gets seriously depressed that young, your antenna should be up also for the fact that this kid has a much higher chance than, say, an 18-year-old who comes in with the first episode of depression. This kid may well be at risk for developing bipolar disorder. What do developmental psychopathologists say? What are the vulnerabilities? Is there a heritable risk for depression? What about girls? Before the age of 10, boys and girls are equally likely to get major depression. Starting at age 11, girls escalate quickly. Are there other early risk factors, both fixed and malleable, that tend to predict the onset of depression? Loss, deaths in the family, very harsh and critical parents, being isolated from your peers. We'll talk in a minute about rumination, the style of thinking where you kind of do the instant replay all day about what went wrong. Puberty is the big period where the risk increases. There's something about biological changes and changes, especially in expectations for girls, that might also be risk factors. So how do these come together to yield major depression? So what is major depression? There's a bunch of symptoms, and we're not going to list them and have you memorize them. It's like 130 often does. But think about a number of kind of systems. Mood. It's good to be in sort of a good mood a lot because it makes you open to experiencing expansive. But if things aren't going well, it's good to have your mood constrict. What if you're pretty chronically sad and just can't experience any joy? So that's one of the symptoms of depression. What about the way you're thinking? People who are depressed can't get out of a negative bias. It's hopeless. Everything I do is wrong. Nothing works. What about your body? People who are depressed often have big sleep problems. Not just trouble falling asleep, but in the most severe depressions, problems staying asleep. Waking up at 3:38 by your digital clock and you're not going back to sleep the rest of the night. Everybody does that occasionally. If you do that regularly, it can be a sign of major depression. Appetite, too. People who are severely depressed tend to either lose 10 or 15 pounds or gain 10 or 15 pounds. So there's some dysregulation in your hormones' underlying appetite. Motivation. Usually like doing a lot of stuff. When I'm depressed, I don't feel like doing any shit that I usually do. This is really a sign of depression. Interpersonally, people initially say, oh my God, what's the matter? And 2 weeks later, what do people say? What's the matter with you? I've been depressed too. Pull out of it. There's a lot of interpersonal animosity after a couple of weeks of depression because people don't really get that there's a mental illness going on. They think you're just lazy or self-indulgent. As depressive symptoms intensify, it becomes nearly inevitable that a person past a certain point will say, I'm hopeless, I'd be better off dead. And in fact, everybody around me would be happier if I were gone because I'm a burden to them. So you think, how indulgent, how could somebody think of suicide? It would crush the family and friends. People who are that depressed think they would be helping everybody else by not being around. That's how distorted the thinking can get. And we say in the DSM, you've got to have had most of those symptoms every day for about 2 weeks. Why 2 weeks? Well, it's kind of arbitrary. Because if you've experienced a major loss, you might feel that way for a week or 10 days. Or if something really goes wrong, our bodies are wired as humans to experience loss and negative events with a lot of these symptoms. But if it's every day for 2 weeks or more, maybe we say you've got this syndrome called depression. What's dysthymic disorder? Some of those symptoms pretty much every day for a year. You know some people like this, the person who's always a downer. Maybe they're never suicidal, maybe never meet criteria for major depression, but it's as though, do they have some vulnerability to experience the world in a very negative way? People who are dysthymic are at high risk for developing a major depression on top of their dysthymia.